America broke one of the crown jewels of its 20th century achievements, nuclear power, and it's going to take a lot of work to fix it again. There are now over 100 new companies with original designs that are ready to push us into the next generation of nuclear reactors. There's no shortage of innovation. Meanwhile, the US has pledged to triple nuclear energy by 2050, and it's now broadly supported by both Republicans and Democrats. AI and data centers are hungry for electricity. Amazon bought one directly connected to a nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. Electric utility stocks are up over 100% this year. Clearly, there's surging demand for clean, reliable power. And yet there are exactly 0 new plants licensed for construction. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. Of the nation's operating reactors, 13 shut down prematurely in the last decade, and dozens more are at risk. The 2 new units at Vogtle were under construction for more than a decade and came in at twice their original budget. The sister units at VC Summer ended up only in scandal and jail time after billions were spent. No one is going to risk building a large nuclear plant in the US again. Meanwhile, countries like Russia and China continue to expand without hesitation and grow their global reach. So what's going on here? Why are they succeeding while the US struggles? Hi everyone, my name is Michael Seeley, and I've been in the nuclear business for 20 years now, both in the US and abroad. And while this video isn't a takedown of the US approach to nuclear energy, it is a wake-up call for those in the government and the public who want to see a continued and expanded use of nuclear energy in the future. Because if we don't change our approach, nuclear energy in America will die a slow, expensive, bureaucratic death. And with it, any hopes of long-term energy security and technological leadership. So with all of that in mind, it's worth talking about nuclear energy in America. Specifically, how we got here, what challenges are we facing, and what we can do about it. Once we do that, we can see how the US, the country with, for now, the largest nuclear fleet in the world, scores on the Atomic Blender Nuclear Energy Leaderboard. To understand the current state of nuclear energy in the US, we need to take a step back and look at how we got here. After World War II, the United States passed the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, establishing the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, to control peacetime development of nuclear energy. The AEC inherited national labs from the Manhattan Project, like Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore, which became centers of nuclear weapons development and early nuclear power research. During this era, nuclear energy grew rapidly in the US, with several reactors being built. However, the Atomic Energy Commission's dual role of both promoting and regulating nuclear energy led to conflicts of interest and public concerns in the 1960s and 70s. In response, the 1974 Energy Reorganization Act ultimately split the AEC into 2 entities: the Department of Energy, overseeing research, weapons development, and energy promotion, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, focused on regulating civilian nuclear safety. And while not perfect, these institutions have carried on with their missions for the last 50 years. Since then, the United States built over 100 nuclear reactors, and today, 94 of them are still in operation. Despite concerns about nuclear energy, which are significant and do deserve their own detailed discussion, there is no question that these reactors provide the country with critical benefits, especially as we add more renewables to the grid. Nuclear power plants give reliable baseload power, running continuously, unlike intermittent solar or wind. This reliability is vital for keeping the grid stable as we add more renewables, which tend to fluctuate. Wind and solar are also often distributed over a large area, and away from population centers where the energy is needed. Meanwhile, nuclear plants are compact and can be located closer to urban centers, reducing transmission losses. Crucially, they produce electricity without emissions, keeping our air clean. Nuclear energy also serves as a source of technological and economic security. The US has been a leader in nuclear technology, with some of the safest and most advanced reactors in the world. This leadership enables the US to export nuclear technology, which not only supports the economy, but also strengthens geopolitical ties with other countries, who then rely on the US for technical support in the future. And technical support for safety extends beyond nuclear power to our own lives online, because it's getting harder and harder to tell what's authentic and what's a scam. Do you know which one of these free Wi-Fi networks is the real one, and which one could intercept your data? It may seem like a cheap spy novel, but this is exactly what happened in Australia, where a man was recently arrested for creating what looked like free public Wi-Fi at airports and on flights, but in actuality, he was allegedly stealing people's data. And that's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, can help. NordVPN protects your data and privacy, so you can safely browse anywhere, even on free public Wi-Fi. But NordVPN goes beyond being just a great VPN with a host of other features to block threats. It has built-in threat protection, which checks that the links are real ones and not scammers impersonating websites that you visit all the time. Because as they get more sophisticated, it's getting almost impossible to be able to tell the difference. That's one of the ways that hackers can steal your passwords and financial information without people even realizing until it's too late. And of course, NordVPN is just a great VPN. With Nord, you can surf the web anonymously and your location stays hidden, because incognito mode isn't really as private as you'd like, with Google admitting in a lawsuit that everyone can still track what you're doing. NordVPN doesn't track where you go or what you do, making sure you keep your information private. If they had been using NordVPN, they would have stayed safe. So give NordVPN a try and keep your data private. Visit nordvpn.com/atomicblender or click the link down in the description and get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan on top of a huge discount. And it's completely risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee. So click the link down in the description to get 4 extra months on a 2-year plan with a 30-day money-back guarantee as well. Which brings us to where we are now. While nuclear power provides these benefits, it remains controversial. And because of this, it faces 3 serious challenges: costs, regulations, and global competition. Take cost. You probably heard that nuclear energy is expensive. After all, look at all the stuff they have to build compared to a wind turbine. To compare the cost of different energy sources, we use something called the levelized cost of electricity. Very basically, levelized cost of energy gives us the average cost of producing electricity from a source over its lifetime, accounting for the initial expense in building it, any staff, operations and maintenance, and fuel. This attempts to give an apples-to-apples comparison of different energy sources. And when we look at nuclear power, it appears to have a high levelized cost of roughly twice that of wind and solar. This is due to things like high upfront costs for construction, complex safety requirements, a skilled workforce, and specialized fuel. On the other hand, wind and solar are cheaper to build, have comparatively fewer safety requirements, and the sun and wind are free. However, the levelized cost is only based on the electricity actually produced. Wind and solar are dependent on weather conditions, which means they aren't always generating power. Imagine if you had a car that only works during the day. Now, that's going to be a problem because sometimes you might want to go places after dark. So now you need to borrow a second car from your friend just for the night, but you're not going to pay him for it. Because your daytime car works and you borrow your friend's car whenever you want, your cost looks much lower than it actually is. The same is true of our electrical grid. The cost of wind and solar is cheap if you only look at them when they're running. But the other half of the time you need something else because we still need electricity if the sun goes down, or if there are, a bunch of clouds. Nuclear plants provide that constant, reliable power, acting as the dependable source that keep the lights on regardless of the external conditions. Integrating renewables also requires additional infrastructure, like batteries or more transmission lines, in order to combat this intermittency and ensure a stable power supply. But these costs aren't always included in the calculations, again making nuclear appear more expensive by comparison. And because utilities are often compensated only for the electricity they produce, not for the reliability they provide, this undervalues the consistent power that nuclear plants deliver. Which isn't really a fair way of doing it, because then nuclear plants are effectively subsidizing wind and solar because of their unreliability. The second challenge is related to rules and regulations. Now, we all want nuclear plants to operate safely in a well-regulated environment, but we also want those regulations to be appropriate for what they're controlling. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is the job of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The NRC has a complicated role, overseeing compliance and enforcing regulations for existing and new reactors. But because these regulations are usually written at a pretty high level, they can be difficult to interpret. To help out with this, the NRC issues what are called regulatory guides, which guide designers and operators on the approaches the NRC views are acceptable to comply with its regulations. Seems simple enough. If a plant wants to know how to comply with the rules for protecting against fires, for example, they can go to the regulatory guide and see exactly how to do that. However, the problem is that over 50 years, the number of regulations and regulatory guides has exploded. At this point, there are 253 regulatory guides for power reactors alone. And each of these can be hundreds of pages long, with sometimes overlapping and conflicting instructions. These ever-expanding rules now resemble a maze on top of a maze on top of a maze, making it impossible to understand without decades of experience. And while these regulatory guides apply to most nuclear reactors, they don't apply to all of them. The vast majority of the NRC's regulations and guidance are specifically for big, traditional reactors, which is fine. But many of the new designs we are seeing are for smaller, simpler reactors, which don't resemble what the NRC normally reviews. Advanced reactors simplify many of the aspects of nuclear technology. They often use different fuels and coolants and rely on passive safety features like natural circulation cooling or inherent physics like gravity. Of the 253 regulatory guides, only 6 give guidance specifically for non-traditional reactors. And this is a huge problem for these newer advanced designs because they don't fit neatly into an existing category. It's like if the Department of Transportation had only written regulations for large 18-wheel semi-trucks. They might do things like specify fuel limits or what kind of driver training is required. And now someone tries to come in with an e-scooter. You can see how trying to apply the rules of a 40-ton truck might not fit. Sure, they both have wheels, but that's about it. Yet this is exactly what the NRC is trying to do in regulating new reactor designs. They have a whole bunch of rules that don't really apply, and they're stuck on what to do, which is then a bit of a nightmare for designers who have to comply with something that doesn't make any sense. To try and address this, the NRC developed a new regulatory framework called Part 53, aimed to be more technology inclusive and performance-based. The idea was that it would be more neutral to allow new reactor designs. But, unfortunately, the draft regulation largely just replicated the old rules and added new layers on top of the existing processes, to the point that the NRC commissioners told the staff to go back and try again. The Breakthrough Institute notes that instead of simplifying the regulatory process, the NRC added complexity that could stifle innovation. They argue that starting from a blank slate might be necessary to create a truly modern and effective regulatory system for advanced reactors. Now, to the NRC's credit, they still perform strong oversight of operating reactors and are widely recognized for being technically very competent and performing research in new areas. But if we look into the agency's financing, things that looked like a good idea at first are actually obstacles that are holding them back. The NRC is primarily funded from licensing fees directly from the nuclear industry, up to about 90%. And it does this because it was mandated by Congress in order to reduce federal spending. However, this means that anytime you want the NRC to review your new reactor design, you're going to have to pay them $300 an hour to look at it. And with many designs requiring over 100,000 hours for review, that's going to get real expensive real quick. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a bit unusual amongst federal agencies. Here, it helps to look at 2 other organizations, the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration. 2 agencies that are also responsible for oversight and setting safety standards in large and complex industries. The FDA is funded through a combination of federal appropriations and user fees, relying on only about 40% of its budget coming from fees. This mixed funding approach helps balance the agency's budget and reduces its reliance on the industry it regulates for money. And while the FAA also requires almost all of its costs to be recovered by fees, most of them don't come directly from the industry it regulates. It imposes fees on activities that are already happening, like passengers flying in and out of airports. You might have noticed these various taxes and fees on your receipt when you book a plane ticket. The FAA does this instead of charging aircraft manufacturers for innovative activities, like certifying new aircraft designs. Compared to the NRC, the FDA and the FAA models support creativity and make sure that developers aren't held back by annual fees. If the FAA was as expensive and cumbersome in licensing new planes as the NRC is with plants, then we'd still all be flying around in planes from the 1970s. Now, the FDA and FAA models aren't perfect, and there's still plenty of room for improvement, as anybody who's flown recently on a Boeing can tell you, but it's still a lot better than how the nuclear industry is controlled. While the NRC's funding model and regulatory processes pose challenges to all players in the nuclear industry, they are particularly difficult for newer, smaller companies who don't have tens of millions of dollars to commit to a review. This creates a significant barrier to entry, essentially allowing only well-established companies or those with extremely deep pockets, literally Bill Gates level of funding, to navigate the regulatory landscape. Even adjusting for inflation, the fees paid to the NRC have risen enormously, between 300% and 800% from the late 1990s to the mid-2010s, for what are essentially the same activities. This escalation in costs makes it nearly impossible for smaller, innovative companies to bring their new technologies to the market. According to the NRC's own data, the cost of reviewing and certifying a new reactor design is between $45 and $70 million. NuScale, a company developing a new, relatively simple small modular reactor, estimates the cost of reviewing and certifying its design was between $55 and $65 million. And this figure does not include an additional $12 million they spent in pre-application fees with the NRC to try and streamline their application in the first place. For comparison, a typical 1,000 megawatt reactor being built in 1968, at a time before the NRC was required to collect its revenues through fees, would have paid just over $300,000 after adjusting for inflation. That's 0.5% of what NuScale paid for a reactor that is twice the size. And that doesn't even include all the work that NuScale had to do to comply with expanded and misaligned regulations, like design revisions, running simulations, preparing reports, and responding to multiple rounds of questions. In total, NuScale estimates that it spent over $500 million getting their design certification from the NRC. So clearly, for a policy and an agency that claims to be supportive of innovation and new designs, the system isn't working. Now, we've been talking a lot about domestic issues, so let's move on to something lighter. America's best friends, Russia and China. International competition, particularly from state-backed companies in Russia and China, affect the US nuclear industry in ways that no other industry faces. These countries dominate the international market by standardizing their design, allowing them to build plants cheaply and efficiently. Together, Russia and China account for 87% of all new reactors worldwide. Russia's Rosatom and China's CNNC sell only a few select models that they then replicate across multiple projects and countries. This reduces the learning curve for each new project and allows them to leverage economies of scale. In contrast, the US has a much more fragmented approach, with multiple designs and components, making it much harder to achieve such efficiencies. Of the 94 reactors in the US today, almost none of them are the same design between different sites, which means anything learned building one plant can be difficult to translate into another. Second, Russia and China use an integrated model that includes design, construction, operations, maintenance, and fuel. This one-stop-shop approach makes it easier for countries to adopt nuclear technology without needing to develop all these capabilities themselves. When Apple sells you a laptop, it comes assembled with everything you need: hardware, software, technical support, cloud storage, and the company will even take it back from you for recycling when you're done. Meanwhile, the US approach means you're stuck building your own computer from dozens or hundreds of different components, hoping that they all work together and assembling it. If you're experienced, this might not be a problem, but if you've never done it before, it could be a real and expensive struggle. The comprehensive package offered by Russia and China is highly attractive to countries looking to develop nuclear energy, but lacking the infrastructure and expertise to do so on their own. But there's one more thing that Russia and China offer: state-subsidized financing. Russia and China offer attractive loan terms to countries looking to develop nuclear energy. Russia provided a $29 billion loan to Egypt, or 85%, for the construction of the El Daba nuclear power plant, while China financed nearly all of Pakistan's Karachi nuclear power plant. These financial arrangements are not just about building nuclear power plants. They're also political tools for economic development and influence. By financing and building these plants, Russia and China can lock in long-term ties with the host countries, ensuring a degree of dependence on their technology and expertise for decades. Egypt's contract includes a 60-year arrangement for fuel supply and maintenance services, effectively tying Egypt's nuclear energy future to Russian technology and support. And China's loan to Pakistan for the Karachi nuclear power station not only provides Pakistan with much-needed energy infrastructure, but also strengthens the strategic partnership between the two countries. The geopolitical implications of these investments are huge, and this influence is particularly potent in regions where energy security is closely linked to national security. Nuclear technology is a sensitive area, and controlling its spread and use has always been a key aspect of international diplomacy. So while Russia and China dominate the international market with state-backed companies, comprehensive service packages, and easy financing, US companies face significant hurdles. American nuclear technology exports are tightly controlled by a multitude of rules and regulations. The two most significant are known as 123 agreements and Part 810. 123 agreements refer to that section of the Atomic Energy Act and behave just like a treaty. Very simply, in exchange for access to US nuclear technology, other countries enter into a 123 agreement with the US government and agree to certain conditions. These require the other country to adhere to the US's standards on non-proliferation, including safeguards on nuclear material and technology to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. It often includes things like submitting to international inspections, restrictions on uranium enrichment, and treatment of nuclear waste. Which is good, but dictating all these requirements might not be aligned with the other country's energy goals or sovereignty. Imagine if, before you bought a Kia, you had to sign an agreement with the South Korean government that you would only use hand-cooked tires, and had to return them when you were done. You might hesitate before buying a Kia then. But that's what 123 agreements do. They tell other countries how to treat nuclear technology that they've purchased according to US standards. And because this is essentially a treaty, it requires navigating a long, complex maze of US bureaucracy and approvals. It slows down the whole process and adds significant costs, making it harder for US companies to compete on price and speed because the US government is directly involved in the negotiations. And once a 123 agreement is in place, there's still more. Known as Part 810 after the section of US federal regulations, this rule controls the actual export of nuclear technology to other countries. It requires US companies and individuals to obtain authorization from the Department of Energy before engaging in certain activities with other countries. This includes transferring nuclear technology, providing training, or even offering basic assistance. And while some general authorizations aren't too hard to get, others can be very, very difficult. Specific authorizations require thorough review by the Department of Energy, in consultation with the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Commerce, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This process can go on for years, adding significant uncertainty and cost to US companies doing business overseas. Again, these delays put US companies at a serious disadvantage compared to their international competitors, who don't have to go through these hurdles. So, with all of these challenges, what can we do? First, the good news is that costs for operating existing nuclear plants in the US have fallen by nearly 40% over the last decade, thanks to industry efficiency improvements. However, there's still more we can do. One significant step would be to adjust official levelized cost of energy calculations used in determining what to build, to better reflect nuclear energy's reliability and capacity for baseload power. To create a fair comparison, we need to include the true costs of each energy source. For wind and solar, this means including additional distribution infrastructure, energy storage systems, and backup power sources that are needed to compensate for their intermittency. Another crucial aspect is to ensure that nuclear plants are compensated for their availability and reliability, not just their production. The current model undervalues the consistent power that nuclear plants deliver, so we need to adjust it to include the steady power and availability as well. We also need to address regulations. They need to evolve to keep pace with technological advancements and streamline the process for new and advanced reactors. We need to make them technology neutral and based on safety outcomes. The current framework is overly prescriptive, designed around older technologies, and doesn't easily accommodate the latest innovations in reactor designs. Advanced reactors often have reduced use of materials and land, less radioactivity, and generate less spent nuclear fuel. These benefits should be reflected in the review process to streamline licensing further. Enabling high-volume licensing is crucial. The current process isn't scalable for the potential new reactor demand. If the goal is to triple nuclear capacity by 2050, we need to address bottlenecks now and develop efficient pathways for handling more applications. A big part of that is going to be getting NRC's Part 53 in line and in a practical form. Whether that means starting over or fixing what there is, we simply cannot wait years to end up with the same regulations that we started with. The NRC has done a lot of research in areas like how advanced reactors will behave and in training to get their staff ready. But these efforts need to translate into regulations and guidance that people can follow. Legislative support is going to be crucial for these regulatory changes. Congress can provide the necessary support and legislative backing to make these reforms happen. This includes appropriating funds for the development of regulatory infrastructure, enabling high-volume licensing, and supporting the transformation efforts. The other critical change for Congress is modifying the NRC's appropriations process. As we've discussed, the NRC relies heavily on industry fees, which can be a significant barrier for new entrants. Instead, the NRC should follow the same appropriations process as other federal agencies. This means receiving a larger portion of its budget directly from congressional appropriations, rather than from industry fees. This would ensure independence, while making it easier for smaller companies to submit new, innovative designs. The recent passage of the ADVANCE Act is a good start. While not perfect, It reduces licensing fees for advanced reactors from $300 an hour to about $160 an hour and provides other incentives, which certainly helps, but it stops short of any true structural changes at the NRC. In addition to domestic reforms, we must also look at the international challenges to level the playing field for the global nuclear market. First, the US needs to clearly define its foreign policy goals around civilian nuclear energy. Programs like the State Department's SMR First initiative aim to support the deployment of small modular reactors in partner countries, promoting US technology and ensuring global energy security. By bolstering such initiatives, the US can strengthen its influence in the global nuclear market and counter the dominance of state-backed entities from Russia and China. Second, the US Export-Import Bank should take a more active role in supporting financing for overseas nuclear projects. Competitive financing is crucial, as seen with Russia and China's state-backed loans. For example, Exim supported the Baraka nuclear energy plant in the UAE in 2012, and although the project was ultimately financed by local banks in Korea, it showed commitment and willingness to support US policy in the Middle East. In any case, to match the financing capabilities of Russia and China, Exim needs to consistently offer robust financial support to US nuclear exporters. Third, we must re-examine how we regulate the export of nuclear technology. Current rules like Section 123 agreements and Part 810 impose significant barriers that slow and complicate the export process. While designed for non-proliferation, their inefficiency hurts US competitiveness. Specific authorizations for nuclear exports now take almost 400 days on average, up from 130 days in the 1990s. Streamlining these processes and providing more delegation authority within the Department of Energy could significantly reduce approval times and enhance our ability to compete globally. By improving the efficiency of these export controls, we can better position US companies on the international market. One of the most significant steps we can do to enhance the competitiveness of US nuclear technology is to support regulatory harmonization. This means aligning regulatory standards across multiple countries to create a more predictable and uniform global framework for nuclear energy. We can look at how other countries have successfully streamlined their regulatory processes, and then take the best parts. The International Atomic Energy Agency is doing just that, promoting international safety standards for nuclear energy. Their Nuclear Harmonization and Standardization Initiative aims to align regulatory and industry approaches across different countries, making it easier for new technologies to be deployed globally. Similarly, the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency is working towards harmonizing nuclear licensing processes for emerging technologies. Their efforts focus on creating a global path forward that leverages best practices from various countries to streamline the regulatory process. This approach is similar to how the aviation industry has established international standards for aircraft design and pilots, making it easier to certify and deploy new models worldwide. The US nuclear industry would gain enormously from a similarly harmonized regulatory environment. Standardizing safety and design criteria across borders would reduce the time and cost for licensing new US reactors abroad, making them more attractive for investors and developers. The Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission must continue to work closely with the IAEA, NEA, and other international bodies to develop and implement common standards and practices. This will not only enhance the safety and efficiency of nuclear energy, but strengthen the global market for US nuclear technology. Okay, now let's see how the US, a country that's in a bit of a need of some reorganization, does on the Atomic Blender Nuclear Energy Leaderboard. Starting with size. America has 94 reactors throughout the country, mostly in the east and south, producing a whopping 772 terawatt-hours of electricity annually. This is far and away the highest in the world, and almost double that of the next closest of China. So on a scale of 1 to 10, it gets a clear 10 out of 10. This massive amount of electricity still contributes a respectable portion of the nation's total energy, providing 18% of the electrical output, which is right in the middle of other nuclear countries, so it gets a 5 out of 10. With its large number of reactors, the first of which started running in the 1950s, no other country has as much total operating experience as the US. But even so, with an aging fleet, capacity factors are only slightly above the world's average, as large maintenance projects and refurbishments are things that newer reactors just don't have to deal with, at least not yet. Still, for operating experience, it gets a strong 8 out of 10. Infrastructure. Research and development, personnel, and an exceptionally strong support system with some of the world's most recognizable nuclear companies means the US is well positioned for pretty much anything it needs. Really, one of the only things it lacks is fabrication facilities for large heavy components like reactor pressure vessels, which all shut down a few decades ago in favor of overseas alternatives. The other thing the US relies heavily on imports for is uranium, mostly coming from neighboring Canada, the US having mined out most of its easily accessible deposits years ago. So, it gets a solid 7 out of 10. Finally, growth. This is one of the areas where the US has struggled, with multiple plants shutting down prematurely due to stiff competition first from natural gas and then from wind and solar. The country's total nuclear output has actually declined by 3% over the last decade, while other sources have grown. However, government support is still relatively strong, with policies intending to see more plants built in the future. It's just a question of whether those will be effective enough. So it gets a 6 out of 10. Overall, this gives the USA a final score of 7.2. Giving it the second spot just below China. Controversial, I know. And don't forget to check out NordVPN to keep your data safe. So visit nordvpn.com/atomicblender or click the link down in the description to get a huge discount on a 2-year plan plus an extra 4 months. And unlike the US, Canada may have found the key to success in expanding nuclear energy. So check out this video to see what our neighbors to the north are doing right. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.